This video examines the case of Van versus Muskogee Creek Nation gaming operations, heard before the Supreme Court of the Muskogee Creek Nation. The case explores critical issues concerning tribal employment law and sovereign immunity. Our program overview covers three main areas: tribal sovereignty, employment rights, and administrative due process. We will explore the authority of indigenous nations to govern and the procedural safeguards required for fair hearings. The core of this case is a wrongful termination appeal. Key legal conflicts involve evaluating the scope of sovereign immunity as a bar to employment claims and defining the minimum due process rights for tribal government employees. The appellant, Elias Van, is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation and a former floor manager. The appellee is MCN Gaming Operations, the commercial arm of the nation, which is asserting sovereign immunity as a jurisdictional bar. Van was employed as a floor manager at River Spirit Casino Resort. The incident leading to termination was an internal investigation regarding a missing deposit, which resulted in his formal dismissal. The triggering event for the legal appeal was the denial of access to exculpatory video evidence used in the investigation. The appellant alleges this constitutes a procedural violation of the Employee Handbook's due process provisions. The administrative action resulted in the formal dismissal of Elias Van after the nation's internal review process concluded. The internal investigation regarding the missing deposit was deemed conclusive, providing the basis for the termination. The tribal court dismissed the case, ruling that the Muskogee Creek Nation had not unequivocally waived its sovereign immunity for employment disputes. This decision resulted in a lack of subject matter jurisdiction for the trial court. This image shows a scene from the Muskogee Creek Nation Supreme Court, where legal arguments are made before the justices. The appellant's first point of error argues that the Employee Handbook is an enforceable contract. They contend that internal policies create a legitimate expectation of compliance, and denying evidence access violated due process. This argument is supported by precedent, including Bailey versus Muskogee Creek Nation, where internal policies were deemed binding, and Doe versus Muskogee Creek Nation, which established a property interest in tribal employment procedures. Point of error number 2 argues for a waiver of immunity via commercial participation. They assert that the nation's commercial gaming activities limit absolute immunity and create a substantive waiver for related employment claims. Supporting cases include C&L Enterprises versus Citizen Band, which noted that tribes can waive immunity through clear commercial agreements, and Potawatomi Tax Commission, which reinforced that sovereign immunity is not absolute in commercial activities. The appellant's core theory is that, quote, sovereignty cannot nullify citizen rights. They argue the handbook is an implied contract, and sovereign immunity does not negate the nation's obligation to provide mandatory due process protections to its workforce. The respondent's case theory relies on the principle of non-diminution. Sovereignty is absolute unless expressly waived. They argue for a presumption of immunity, and that the internal grievance process is the exclusive remedy, barring external judicial review. The respondent's primary argument, point of error number 1, contends that there was no express waiver of sovereign immunity. They cite the Creek Constitution, which requires a clear legislative act to waive immunity. Case support for this position includes the Muskogee Creek Nation versus Russell, which requires an express waiver by the council. Also, Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez established that tribal court jurisdiction is limited to what the tribe dictates. The respondent's second point asserts that the Employment Handbook is not a contract. The nation maintains that the handbook is a policy document, explicitly disclaiming any implied contract and preserving the quote, at-will employment status. This stance is backed by the handbook's explicit disclaimers and the common law principle that employment manuals do not automatically create contractual rights, reinforcing the tribe's discretion in personnel management. The final point of error concerns the separation of powers. The nation argues that the judiciary cannot encroach upon the nation's executive function by creating new procedural rights in employment law, preserving the institutional balance of governance. We now examine three key precedents, establishing the legal foundations of sovereignty. Kiowa Tribe versus Manufacturing Tech asserts immunity for both governmental and commercial activities, regardless of location.